Hello, my name is Dave Emory. This is Side 1 of For the Record program number 658, titled Update on the Meltdown. This is being recorded on December 28th of the year 2008, the last recorded broadcast for calendar year 2008. Before we get into the main topic of the program, which obviously is dealing with the financial collapse and attempts at correcting that, we're going to be dealing at great length with the Maddoff scandal. But before we get into the main body of the broadcast, this program epitomizes why listeners should use the website. It is by far and away the best individual resource for anti-fascist material, Spitfirelist.com. Without a use of this website and the materials on it, the program that I'm about to present to you simply will not impact as it could and, frankly, should. In particular, the book Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile, about the Bormann Capital Network, what one banker called the greatest concentration of money power under a single control in human history. Without reading that book, or at least reading excerpts of it and an understanding of it, and beyond that, how the Bormann Capital Network and fascism in general are outgrowths of the international cartel system. It's actually redundant, but the international monopoly system that was formed at the end of World War I and that precipitated fascism and the Second World War. It really was the first substantive manifestation of what we call now globalization. One, I guess, could say that the colonial age and the formation of the British East India Company was maybe the start. I think that really what we call globalization began with the Webb-Pomerene Act and the events after World War I, about which I've spoken so often. But in particular, using the book Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile, the other books that are available for download for free on Spitfirelist.com, and cross-referencing those with other program descriptions are essential. In particular, we're going to be talking about the Bormann Network's use of Jews as frontmen and operatives during the course of this broadcast. That is documented at length in the book Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile by the late heroic Paul Manning, colleague of and protege of the late Edward R. Murrow, who spurred Paul Manning to do the research on the Bormann Network. Also, talking about another key element of that book and how the German occupation, the German economic occupation of France and other European countries never really ended. Dovetailing the material about the French power elite and their role as a key element of the Bormann Network, dovetailing that with the book Triumph of Treason by Pierre Coe, part of which is available for download on the website, and excerpts of which are available in various broadcasts. That will flesh out listeners' understanding on a couple of key points, namely, again, the role of the French power elite and economic elite in the Bormann Network, and the Bormann Network's use of Jews as frontmen, as front and center in discussion of the Maddoff case. So please, Spitfirelist.com. We're going to open up with an article that I'm sure many of you are aware of, and it's important. It's also disgusting. MSNBC.com accessed an Associated Press story. Banks keep bailout spending secret. Subtitled, Banks Unable or Unwilling to Disclose How They're Spending Billions in Aid. Parenthetically, of course, that comes from us, the taxpayers, folks. And the article reads in part, it's something any bank would demand to know before handing out a loan. Where's the money going? But after receiving billions in aid from U.S. taxpayers, the nation's largest banks say they can't track exactly how they're spending the money, or they simply refuse to discuss it. We've lent some of it. We've not lent some of it. We're not giving any accounting of here's how we're doing it, said Thomas Kelly, a spokesman for J.P. Morgan Chase, which received $25 billion in emergency bailout money. We have not disclosed that to the public. We're declining to. Unquote. The Associated Press contacted 21 banks that received at least $1 billion in government money and asked 4 questions. How much has been spent? What was it spent on? How much is being held in savings? And what's the plan for the rest? None of the banks provided specific answers. Quote, we're not providing dollar-in, dollar-out tracking, said Barry Coling, a spokesman for Atlanta, Georgia-based SunTrust Banks Incorporated, which got $3.5 billion in taxpayer dollars. Some banks say they simply didn't know where the money was going. We manage our capital in its aggregate, said Regions Financial Corporation spokesman Tim Dayton, who said the Birmingham, Alabama-based company is not tracking how it is spending the $3.5 billion it received as part of the financial bailout. The answers highlight the secrecy surrounding the Troubled Asset Relief Program, which earmarked $700 billion, about the size of the Netherlands economy, to help rescue the financial industry. The Treasury Department has been using the money to buy stock in U.S. banks, hoping that the sudden inflow of cash will get banks to start lending money. There has been no accounting of how banks spent that money. Lawmakers summoned bank executives to Capitol Hill last month and implored them to lend the money, not to hoard it or to spend it on corporate bonuses, junkets, or to buy other banks. But there is no process in place to make sure that's what's happening, and there are no consequences for banks who don't comply. It's entirely appropriate for the American people to know how their taxpayer dollars are being spent in private industry, said Elizabeth Warren, the top congressional watchdog overseeing the financial bailout. Skipping down, we read still more about the bailout and some of the comments of some of the bankers who've been getting bailed out but don't want to tell us who is exactly in the boat or how much water has been bailed out. We're choosing not to disclose that, said Kevin Heine, a spokesman for Bank of New York Mellon, which received about $3 billion. Can you believe this? We're the taxpayers interjecting. Obviously, this is a bit of spontaneous editorialization. We're lending money to the Mellons, for crying out loud, and to the Morgans, and they are declining to tell us how they're doing it. Well, I think that's great. Just bleeping fantastic. Beginning again, we're choosing not to disclose that, said Kevin Heine, spokesman for Bank of New York Mellon, which received about $3 billion. Others said the money couldn't be tracked. Bob Denham, a spokesman for North Carolina-based BB&T Corporation, said the bailout money doesn't have its own bucket, unquote. But he said taxpayer money wasn't used in the bank's recent purchase of a Florida insurance company. Asked how he could be sure since the money wasn't being tracked, Denham said the bank would have made that deal regardless. Others, such as Morgan Stanley spokesman Carissa Ramirez, offered to discuss the matter with reporters on condition of anonymity. When AP refused, Ramirez sent an email saying, "We are going to decline to comment on your story," unquote. Most banks wouldn't say why they were keeping the details secret. We're not sharing any other details. We're just not at this time, said Wendy Walker, a spokesman for Dallas-based Comerica Incorporated, which received $2.25 billion from the government. Heine, the New York Mellon Corporation spokesman who said he wouldn't share spending specifics, added, "I just prefer if you wouldn't say that we're not going to discuss these details." Well, I'll tell you, it is difficult on a personal note for me to read that and not reach into the foulest backwaters of my vocabulary, thereby getting the stations that air this program in serious FCC difficulties. That, folks, that's obscene. It may not be any four-letter words. That is Dave Emory, the Dave Emory Communications Commission's definition of serious obscenity. A very insightful column, perhaps shedding some light on why these banks don't want us to know what they're doing with the money. Obviously, folks, they're really not doing anything good, or they'd be telling us. The lack of transparency is only too telling in its own way. The San Francisco Chronicle of December 15th of 2008 carried a very insightful and eloquent column by David Sirota, an up-and-coming author and commentator whose work his op-ed columns have been featured in numerous online, and in the case of the San Francisco Chronicle, daily newspapers, online outlets and daily newspapers. David Sirota has a column called "We Told You So." Please forgive me for saying it. I know it's a tad annoying, but it has to be said to America's ruling class in this humble column space. Because if it's not said here, then you can bet it won't be said anywhere else, and it needs to be said somewhere on behalf of the millions of citizens who were right. We told you so. In the slow-motion train wreck that became the economic meltdown, our bipartisan political establishment and the sycophantic pundit bureau have been wrong over and over and over again. They told us that eviscerating consumer protections would unleash the market's benevolent power and boost the economy. They told us that a $1 trillion Wall Street bailout would solve a credit crisis. They told us that bailout would be subjected to intense oversight and scrutiny. Wrong, wrong, and wrong again. And when critics predicted just that, sneering commentators and congressional leaders berated us as know-nothing Luddites, conspiracy theorists, or both. But with the release of 3 more new reports, there's no debate anymore. The studies proved that the critics were right and the ideologues of Washington were wrong. When in 2005, Congress overwhelmingly passed a credit card industry-written bill gutting bankruptcy laws, progressives were right to try to stop it, and not just because it was an immoral move to legalize usury. We were right because, as the New York Federal Reserve Bank reports, the bill played an integral role in the foreclosure surge that crashed the economy. In the past, bankruptcy laws made sure debtors first and foremost continued to pay their mortgages so that they would stay in their homes. But the 2005 legislation effectively compels debtors to first pay off their credit cards, meaning many of them have no money left to pay their mortgages. The Fed's report estimates that the bankruptcy bill is causing 32,000 more foreclosures per quarter than the economy would have already generated. We told you so. When almost every media voice in America was sounding the alarm of financial panic and demanding a Wall Street bailout plan, when bailout opponents were roundly ridiculed as irresponsible by politician and pundit alike, those opponents were nonetheless right to say then what a study from the Minneapolis Federal Reserve Bank says now, that the case hadn't been made. While reporters and the Bush administration frantically insisted that bank-to-business lending had ceased, interbank lending had stopped, and short-term commercial paper loans had dried up, the Minneapolis researchers tell us that, quote, all 3 claims were false and continue to be false, and that, quote, nobody has explained how the money system has frozen when the data says it has not, unquote, and that a, quote, $1 trillion intervention warranted a bit more serious analysis. Unquote. This last paragraph again, listen to this very carefully. While reporters in the Bush administration frantically insisted that bank-to-business lending had ceased, interbank lending had stopped, and short-term commercial paper loans had dried up, the Minneapolis researchers tell us that all 3 claims were false, unquote, and continue to be false, and that, quote, nobody has explained how the money system has frozen when the data says it has not, unquote, and that a $1 trillion intervention warranted a bit more serious analysis. We told you so. When lawmakers said that the bailout included strict oversight measures, skeptics were right to say that that claim was patently untrue. According to a new analysis by federal officials at the Government Accountability Office, non-existent oversight means, quote, taxpayers may not be adequately protected, unquote, and that the bailout's stated goal of fixing the economy may not be achieved in an efficient and effective manner, unquote. Yes, we told you so. And so now, even though these damning reports have garnered scant news coverage, perhaps there will be a change. As we, the pragmatic progressive majority, demand tough new financial regulations, job-creating investments in public infrastructure, labor law reforms, universal health care, revised trade policies, a repeal of the odious bankruptcy bill, and an end to Wall Street welfare, maybe our humiliated rulers will start listening. Maybe. Anybody want to bet on it? Send me an email through thespitfirelist.com or through WFMU, and we'll see what kind of odds you want to give us. Another David Sirota column also from the San Francisco Chronicle, this one from Friday, December 26th of 2008. This one called Economic Death and Millionaire Taxes. It reads, for most of us, Benjamin Franklin's words in 1789 still apply. Nothing is certain but death and taxes. However, millionaires by definition are not most of us. While they can't stave off the Grim Reaper, they can persuade lawmakers to shield them from the tax man and balance budgets on the backs of everyone else. That's what's going on in revenue-starved states right now. Governors are preparing to slash middle-class programs and are resisting calls to raise taxes on the wealthy. Nowhere is this class war more pronounced than in New York, the home of the financial thieves who killed the economy in the first place. Having halved its top tax rate over the last 3 decades, New York today faces a $15.4 billion deficit. In response, Governor David Paterson, a Democrat, might have asked his state's Gordon Geckos to pay higher taxes, especially considering the idea's popularity in polls and the news that Wall Street's elites are still swimming in money. Indeed, according to CBS News, the alleged beleaguered financial industry is so flush with cash it plans to dole out $14 billion in executive bonuses this year. Yet far from forcing robber barons to pay their fair share, Patterson told the New York Times that taxing millionaires, quote, is the last place you want to go, unquote. Instead, he proposes to punish Joe and Jane Sixpack by hiking the taxes and cutting the programs that disproportionately impact them. Specifically, he wants to increase sales taxes, college tuitions and licensing fees, and slash education and low-income health programs. Patterson defended his proposals by telling PBS's Bill Moyers, quote, that when you tax the wealthy in the downturn of an economy, you have an automatic link of a loss of job opportunities and then a loss of population, unquote. The rationale sounds intelligently pragmatic until you peruse the relevant data. When New Jersey recently raised taxes on the wealthy, Princeton University researchers found that most of those who later left the state moved to places with higher taxes, meaning there is no causative link between levies on the rich and residential flight. Likewise, when New York temporarily raised high-income taxes after 9/11, the state added 127,000 jobs, meaning no link exists between higher taxes on the rich and job loss. During times of surpluses, governors could get away with the unsubstantiated nonsense Patterson is peddling, but now 43 states confront shortfalls, and because states cannot run deficits, the dollars and cents of these arguments matter. Lawmakers must choose what policy will create the best chances for economic recovery: spending tax or tax increases, and if the latter, on whom? The answer isn't rocket science. A Nobel Prize-winning economist, Joseph Stiglitz, says reductions in government spending on goods and services are more likely to be more damaging to the economy in the short run than tax increases focused on higher-income families, unquote. That's because government cuts automatically decrease the consumptive spending programs that broadly stimulate the economy, whereas tax increases, when aimed at the wealthy, more often impact funds socked away in savings. The more that the modest tax increases are focused on those with lower propensities to consume, i.e. the rich, Stiglitz notes, the less damage is done to the weakened economy, unquote. Incredibly, Patterson acknowledges how destructive his budget is, admitting that his own, quote, education cuts are draconian, the health care cuts are prohibitive, and the taxes that are being levied are not fair, unquote. So why would he or any governor nonetheless try to legislate such idiocy? Because millionaires are the one who finance gubernatorial candidacies, and their campaign contributions buy tax protection. The result is what another New York royalist promised: only the little people pay taxes, unquote, said Leona Helmsley, a doctrine that will exacerbate this recession if states keep making it true. Well, again, that speaks for itself. Again, to really, that's obscene, folks. Four-letter words aren't obscene. They're perhaps tasteless, perhaps overly colorful, but when I read stuff like that, or so much of this, it really it taxes my FCC awareness, because it inclines me to reach into the foulest backwaters of my vocabulary. A timely death, perhaps merely a coincidence, perhaps not. New York Times of December 1st of 2008 carried the obituary of Doris Dungey. I'm not sure how that's pronounced, Dungey. Doris Dungey, prescient finance blogger, dies at 47. The blogger Tanta, an influential voice on the mortgage collapse, died Sunday morning in Columbus, Ohio. Tanta, who reached for calculated risk, a finance and economics blog, was a pseudonym for Doris Dungey, who until recently had lived in Upper Marlboro, Maryland. The cause of death was ovarian cancer, her sister Kathy Stickelmeyer said. Thanks in part to Tanta's contributions, calculated risk became a crucial source of pressure and analysis as the housing market at first faltered, then collapsed, and finally spawned a full-blown credit crisis. Tanta and her extensive knowledge of the loan industry to comment, castigate, and above all, instruct. Her fans range from the Nobel laureate Paul Krugman, an op-ed columnist for the New York Times who cited her in his blog, to analysts at the Federal Reserve who cited her in a paper on understanding the securitization of subprime mortgage credit. Well, certainly a very conveniently timed death. Perhaps it was just coincidence. The stated cause of death was ovarian cancer. It is a matter of fact that by the early 50s, the intelligence community had perfected means of assassinating people through cancer. In the age of genetic engineering and the use of so-called magic bullets, which can target medicines and perhaps, who knows, carcinogens or other toxins, or perhaps genetically engineered cells, to specific tissues, I wouldn't dismiss. I would also note that, for example, the late Dr. Larry Ford, who collaborated with the apartheid regime in South Africa in its biological warfare program, Project Coast, did so on behalf of the Central Intelligence Agency, an individual who used the Turner Diaries as his political Bible. This guy was basically an obstetrician, and so he might very well have been in a position, or somebody of that ilk, to do something like that. By the way, one of the late Dr. Larry Ford's clients was Margot Hemingway, who died precipitously of an alleged overdose of drugs. Who knows whether Larry Ford prescribed those drugs to her, and whether he actually structured things in such a way as that well-known liberal would have died. I believe that Larry Ford is one of the people who should be investigated in connection with the anthrax attacks. Before we launch into the Maddoff scandal, and we're going to be devoting the rest of the program to the Maddoff fund collapse, there's a quote from roughly 1937. The late Walter Benjamin, the black sheep, so to speak, of the Frankfurt School of Economics, an individual who died in 1940 trying to flee Nazi Germany and get into Switzerland, had the following. Now, Benjamin was influenced by Marxist ideology, as the rhetoric here will be clear, although not a Marxist. I do think that there are some insights that the Marxist school has provided that do have a certain amount of validity. Again, I think there are fundamental flaws in Marxism, particularly its prescriptions for the ills of capitalism. But on the other hand, the following, I think, is only too relevant in this time. The late Walter Benjamin, again, the black sheep of the Frankfurt School, had the following to say about 1937. With the upheaval of the market economy, we begin to recognize the monuments of the bourgeoisie as ruins even before they have crumbled. Amen, Mr. Benjamin. Now, the Maddoff Fund. Bernard Maddoff, a Jew, someone we will talk about in connection with Bormann Jews, and also some of the damage he has done, certainly to Jewish fortunes, literally to Jewish philanthropy, and to a certain extent to funding Israeli infrastructure. Bernard Maddoff had a $50 billion Ponzi scheme going. Its collapse was revealed the largest Ponzi scheme in history. And Bernard Maddoff would have us believe, and those who are taking this enormous scandal at face value would have us believe, that in effect he is Lee Harvey Madoff. He is a lone, not necessarily a nut, but a lone procreant or miscreant under the circumstances. The CNN.com website has the following. Did Madoff act alone? This is by Katie Brenner, dated December 19th of 2008. It's originally from Fortune magazine. Did Madoff act alone? It's hard enough to legitimately manage $50 billion. To falsify books and hide that big a sum, though, experts suggest Bernard Madoff had help. But who? Well, later on in the broadcast, where I'm going to suggest maybe who helped, but let's read a little bit of this. Like the conclusion that Lee Harvey Oswald was a lone gunman, the theory that Bernard Madoff acted alone is hard to swallow. True, Madoff had allegedly confessed that he perpetrated a massive fraud that left behind $50 billion in losses, and he claimed to have done this all alone. But this is a man who kept false records, sent bogus documentation, built investors for billions, lied for years to friends, and knowingly harmed charities. It's within the realm of acceptable behavior to cast a jaundiced eye upon his confession. Skipping down. Quoting Ron Geffner, a partner at the law firm Sadis & Goldberg, that specializes in structuring, organizing, and counseling hedge funds, it's hard to imagine that given the amount of assets that he managed, that people would not have been aware. If nothing else, employees, no matter what floor they were on, would have known that somewhere within the firm money was being lost, Geffner adds. Well, we're going to talk about some people who had seen this coming, and we're also going to talk about something. One of my favorite quotes comes from Nietzsche. A joke is the epigram on the death of a feeling. Later on, we're going to talk about the quote accounting firm, note the quotes, that was keeping track, allegedly, of Madoff's operation. It's funny in a really sick and very disturbing sort of way. But Lee Harvey Madoff, as I'm going to call him for the rest of the broadcast, was not a lone nut. His disclaimers to the contrary notwithstanding. There were a lot of people involved in this. The San Francisco Chronicle of Thursday, December 18th of 2008, among other sources, provides us with information about one of the people implicated in this, or in, as I like to call it, the milieu of Lee Harvey Madoff. Or as a trusted friend and colleague said, a community of interests, or as the Germans and Nazis called it, Interessengemeinschaft. IG Farben stands for a community of interests. The following is an AP story, Dateline Washington. It's by Pete Yost and Marcy Gordon. Headlined, Attorney General recuses self from Ponzi scheme investigation. The fraud investigation of Wall Street money manager Bernard Madoff took unusual twists Wednesday as the U.S. Attorney General removed himself, and the Securities and Exchange Commission looked into the relationship between Madoff's niece and a former SEC attorney who reviewed Madoff's business. Skipping down, U.S. Attorney General Michael Mukasey recused himself from the Madoff probe because his son Mark Mukasey is representing Frank DiPasquale, a top financial officer at Madoff's investment firm. The Justice Department refused to say when Mukasey became aware of the conflict, but confirmed Wednesday he is removing himself from all aspects of the case. DiPasquale was the Madoff employee who had the most day-to-day contact with the firm's investors, unquote. So Lee Harvey Madoff, at the very least, the investigation into Lee Harvey Madoff's crimes has caused the Attorney General to recuse himself because his son is the attorney for one of the principal players in this operation. Another of the questions: where did the money go? By Rachel Beck of the Associated Press. This from the San Francisco Chronicle of Wednesday, December 24th of 2008. It reads in part, again, the title, The Madoff Mystery, Where Did Money Go? It has become the biggest mystery to emerge from the $50 billion Bernard Madoff scandal. Where did all the money go? Federal investigators are likely to take months trying to answer that question as they dig through the disgraced investors' records and attempt to unravel what may be the biggest financial fraud in history. But several theories are being discussed among financial experts and at Wall Street water coolers, Palm Beach country clubs, and the offices of university accounting professors. Among the theories, Madoff lost a bundle in bad investments, paid some of the money out to investors, stashed cash in foreign banks, and spent some on his lavish lifestyle. There was also the possibility he inflated his claim of $50 billion in losses. Well, we're going to examine this at some length down the road. Later on, actually, in Side 2 of the program, which is going to begin because we're almost out of time on Side 1. Suffice it to say that the available evidence suggests very strongly that Lee Harvey Madoff was not the lone perpetrator of this particular operation. We're going to take a look at some of the individuals and some of the institutions that figure very largely in this. Again, as I said at the beginning of the broadcast, this program exemplifies why listeners should use SpitfireList.com. That's the website which I've put together with the heroic efforts of a remarkable webmaster. But let me tell you, folks, there is more and better information about anti-fascism on that website than anywhere else you're going to look, and it's growing all the time. And this program also exemplifies why listeners, serious listeners, should use the descriptions for the program, because there will be information in the description that I do not have time to put in the broadcast itself. Also, many of these programs are admittedly very dense. They're not easy to follow. I do not intend these to be the final word on these things, but rather something of a journalistic step-up transformer to inform others. Please use the SpitfireList.com website, use the descriptions, use the audio files that are linked, and the linked websites, in particular the book Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile, and the excerpted description for the record 305. That'll give you information about Bormann Jews and about the French elites, the French economic elites' role in the Bormann network, because it certainly looks like Lee Harvey Madoff was not a lone nut. This concludes Side 1 of For the Record program number 658. Update on the meltdown. This has been recorded on December 28th of the year 2008. My name's Dave Emory. Happy New Year. Hello, my name's Dave Emory, and this is Side 2 of For the Record program number 658, titled Update on the Meltdown. This has been recorded on December 28th of the year 2008. Please, SpitfireList.com, the best source for anti-fascist information on Earth. We're going to plunge right in where we left off in side one. Again, this program is updating people on the financial meltdown and the economic meltdown. Reminds me of the introduction to Kurt Vonnegut's novel, The Sirens of Titan, in which Vonnegut wrote many, many years ago, by the way, almost half a century ago. Our story begins a long, long time ago, during the Nightmare Age, sometime between the Second World War and the Third Great Depression. Yes, indeed. Bernard Madoff, as we indicated in side one, has claimed himself to be the lone nut behind this. Many people are highly skeptical of this. Among the immediate elements of fallout was the fact that the Attorney General of the United States recused himself from the investigation of Lee Harvey Madoff because his son, that is to say Mark Mukasey, is representing one of Madoff's top associates in this particular operation, one Frank D. Piscali from New Jersey. And we're going to be investigating and ruminating about Lee Harvey Madoff and the largest Ponzi scheme in history for most of this side of the broadcast. Now, we concluded side one of the program with an article from the San Francisco Chronicle of Wednesday, December 24th of 2008. The Madoff mystery, where did the money go? Well, indeed, we're going to be talking about where the money might have gone, among other things. And obviously, with my perhaps overly heavy-handed sarcasm in calling Madoff Lee Harvey Madoff, this guy did not do this alone, folks. And we're going to be taking a look at some of the individuals and institutions that figure in this investigation. Skipping down in this Rachel Beck AP Press story. There is also speculation that the money could show up in other spots, maybe in offshore bank accounts, in family members' names, or elsewhere. Well, first of all, as far as offshore bank accounts, in one of the many points of reference that listeners should use here, and again, SpitfireList.com, are the broadcasts and the descriptions for the broadcasts with the remarkable Lucy Commissar, who's been doing a great deal of work about offshore. And maybe people thought that that was a bit of a reach and that it didn't have a whole lot of relevance. Well, just examine what Lucy was talking about on this program in October of 2008 in, for the record, 531, talking about AIG and all of its use of offshore. Well, now we've had to bail out AIG and a whole lot of other people that aren't telling us where the money went. And among the places where the money may have gone, and we're going to talk a lot more about these destinations, and again, now offshore may very well be where the money is being laundered, so to speak. Laundering the money offshore appears to be one of the things that was going on with Lee Harvey Madoff's operations. New York Times of December 24th of 2008 highlighted one of the considerations. This is an article by Nelson D. Schwartz. It's headlined, Madoff Dealings Tarnish a Private Swiss Bank. It reads in part, for generations, the calling card of Swiss private bankers has been the promise of prudence and discretion. Now, as the links between Bernard L. Madoff and elite private banks like Geneva-based Union Bancaire Privée emerge, this well-polished reputation has been tarnished by the $50 billion Ponzi scheme that Mr. Madoff has been arrested for and accused of running. L'affaire Madoff, as it has become known here and in Geneva, here being Paris, by the way, has cast an unwanted spotlight onto the normally shadowy world of private bankers in Switzerland and other cozy hiding places of offshore wealth like the Cayman Islands and Luxembourg. And while there are many Swiss victims in terms of total exposure, UBP is the best-known private bank to get hit with $700 million of its clients' monies invested with Mr. Madoff. Founded in 1969 by Edgar Di Picciotto, UBP quickly became a giant in the conservative world of Swiss banking, where partnerships like Pictet and Lombard-Odier stretch back more than 200 years. With assets of $125 billion and a client base of wealthy individuals, families, and institutions that reach from Qatar to Uruguay to Russia and throughout Europe, it is one of Switzerland's biggest pipelines for channeling client money into hedge funds worldwide and, Dave would add, offshore. About 6 years ago, that business, known as a fund of funds, began to rake in larger fees when it decided to set up a vehicle called M Invest Limited to funnel cash to Mr. Madoff's firm. Through this relationship, UBP claimed it was able to gain close insight into Mr. Madoff's investment operations through copies of trade tickets and an unusual degree of access granted by Mr. Madoff himself to UBP's representatives, according to a confidential internal letter sent to investors on December 17th and obtained by the New York Times. The memorandum, while seeking to reassure investors, could raise questions about why UBP, unlike others who claim to have seen red flags, did not use its access to delve more deeply into the unusually consistent annual returns that Mr. Madoff's funds were reporting. Well, later on we're going to see maybe why UBP didn't feel too inclined to look too deeply. But let's see where this M Invest Limited was incorporated. Where did it operate out of? Skipping down. The UBP letter acknowledges some concerns over how Mr. Madoff's firm combined investment management and brokerage services, but the Geneva Bank said it found comfort, unquote, in the fact that the firm was subject to routine, unquote, audits by the Securities and Exchange Commission and FINRA, another securities regulator, as well as, quote, Madoff's long-standing reputation in building Wall Street's markets infrastructure, unquote. M Invest was regulated by the Cayman Islands Monetary Authority, where it was incorporated. Well, Cayman Islands, folks, is offshore. Talking about something being regulated through the Cayman Islands is the ultimate oxymoron. The whole point of the Cayman Islands, Luxembourg and Liechtenstein, the Channel Islands, the Bahamas, Bermuda, the whole rationale is to keep those funds opaque and their use opaque so that people can't find out where the money's going. And so that is really interesting indeed. As we get into this, we're going to see, and again, those broadcasts, the many broadcasts with the remarkable and heroic Lucy Commissar about offshore are only too relevant here. Now let's jump back briefly to the San Francisco Chronicle article from Wednesday, December 24th of 2008, The Madoff Mystery, Where Did the Money Go? Well, we're going to take a look at maybe where some of the money that was being handled by Lee Harvey Madoff went. And one of the theories is that, quote, it went into investors' pockets. Well, how about that? It went into investors' pockets. Well, we're going to take a look at who some of those investors, into whose pockets it may have gone. Some of the mystery, where did the money go? Went into investors' pockets. Well, obviously, it went into some investors' pockets, and other people got reamed big time in this thing. Went into investors' pockets. While many of the investors lost everything, some of them received payouts from Madoff over the years. Given that this was a Ponzi scheme, Madoff had to keep up his credibility by allowing people to tap their cash when they wanted. Consider a couple with a $20 million investment with Madoff. They might have pulled out 10% or $2 million a year to use as income, basically living off the returns on their initial investment. So some of the money may have been paid out to knowledgeable inside investors. We're going to take a look at a lot of people were investing in this. A lot of people got burned. There has not been a lot of discussion of this one investor, this from the Investors Hub website. Among the investors who were involved here, and I would suggest the possibility that maybe this particular investor knew that things were not as they should have been and got a lot of money out. Guess who one of the investors was? The Thiessen family, folks, the old funders of the Third Reich, the partners of the Bush family in funding Hitler going back to the early 1920s. The Thiessen family, one of the principal elements of the Bormann Capital Network, as I talk about in For the Record 273. Yes, folks, the Thiessens were an investor here. I wonder if a bunch of the money went to the Thiessens. Of course, I'm just a conspiracy theorist, and I'm sure that the Thiessens would not have used Lee Harvey Madoff to do anything untoward. I mean, when have the Thiessens ever done anything untoward? I don't know. Anyway, from Investors Hub, among the investors, Thiessen family. Source sends the following. Thybo, Thybo Investments, grew out of a family office for Thiessen. They have been in fund of funds, it seems, since 1989. Thybo International is a proper fund of fund, but its newer Class G invests only in one manager, and I'm 99% sure it's Madoff, as the returns are almost the same. Some more info. The fund started in January of 2007. Ernst & Young, Luxembourg, are the auditors. Luxembourg, by the way, one of the major offshore elements. UBS Luxembourg is the administrator. And by the way, in the book Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile, it talks about the pivotal role of Luxembourg and also Liechtenstein, but Luxembourg in particular in helping to launder money for the Bormann Group. Thibault states on their webpage, quote, "Our track record incorporates audited financial statements at both a composite firm-wide and individual portfolios level," unquote. Well, that's very reassuring. So among the investors in the Madoff, the funds of Lee Harvey Madoff, the Thyssen family, using Luxembourg proprietaries. I wonder, obviously this is what I call food for thought and grounds for further research, I wonder how much of the money went to the Thysens who were invested in this. The Thysens, in addition to old running mates of the Bush family and helping to fund fascism going back to the early 20s. The Thysens, major financiers of the Third Reich, major component of the Bormann Group, and very close to the Bormann family and Martin Bormann in particular since the early 1920s. Again, go to the website, read the book Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile, or at the very least use the description for the record 305 with search engines. That'll flesh that out for you. Now, one of the people who apparently was very upset at the shenanigans of Lee Harvey Madoff, perhaps this was just a suicide. I'm extremely skeptical, although it may be that the individual was told, look, you do it or we'll do it. But there have been a number of stories about this particular one from Comcast.net. New York investor who invested in Madoff is found dead. An alleged suicide, I've got my doubts, but we'll see. What is really significant here is not only the fact that this individual deep-sixed himself, or was deep-sixed, remains to be seen, but who this individual was. This particular individual was a member of the long-standing French power elite, and the French financial elite in particular, as discussed at length and in detail in the book Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile, and as we talked, as excerpted in the description for the record 305, the German economic occupation of France, as well as much of the rest of Europe, never ended. And the French power elite and the French economic elite are inextricably linked with the Bormann capital network, as is the Thyssen family. And we'll take a note of that also, as discussed in the book Triumph of Treason, part of which is available for download for free, and in which there are many references, again, on the website spitfirelist.com. The French power elite conspired with their German cartel partners in the run-up to World War II. There were some abortive fascist coups in France prior to the German invasion in 1940, rather like the coup attempt that we had in 1934. They didn't succeed, and so the French power elite deliberately subverted the French defense in World War II to see to it that the Nazis won, because it was only with a military victory by the armies of their cartel partners that democracy could be dispensed with in France and a fascist government imposed, which is what they wanted. Again, the following from Comcast.net, Wednesday, December 24th. New York investor who invested in Madoff is found dead. It reads in part, "He was a distinguished investor who traced his lineage to the French aristocracy, hobnobbed with members of European high society, and sailed around the world on fancy yachts. But after losing more than $1 billion of his clients' money to Bernard Madoff, René Thierry Magon de la Villechouet had enough. He locked the door of his Madison Avenue office and apparently swallowed sleeping pills and slashed his wrists with a box cutter," police said. A security guard found his body Tuesday morning next to a garbage can placed to catch the blood. The bloody scene marked a grisly turn in the Madoff scandal, in which money managers and investors were ensnared in an alleged $50 billion Ponzi scheme. De la Villechouet is believed to have lost about $1.4 billion to Madoff. No suicide note was found, said New York Police Department spokesman Paul Brown. Ellen Borikov, spokesman for the city medical examiner, said the autopsy on de la Villechouet had been completed Wednesday. She said the medical examiner was awaiting toxicology reports before determining the cause of death. Skipping down. De la Villechouet, 65, was an esteemed financier who tapped his upper-crust European connections to attract clients. It was not immediately clear how he knew Madoff or who his clients were. Note that. A lot of mystery about this, as well as did he really kill himself, or was it live, as I say, or was it Memorex? Speaking of de la Villechouet, and I may be mispronouncing that, A partner in the firm, he grew increasingly subdued after the Maddoff scandal broke, drawing suspicion among janitors in his office Monday night when he demanded that they be out of there by 7 p.m. A partner in the firm asked a security guard later in the evening to check and see if de la Ville Chouet was still there, but the door was locked, Police Commissioner Raymond Kelly said. When a guard came into the 22nd story office suite the next morning, less than 13 hours later, the Frenchman was dead, Brown said. There were several cuts, quote, to his arm, to his wrist, and also to his bicep area, unquote, Kelly said. Note that. To his arm, to his wrist, and to his bicep area. If he was going to kill himself, you think he would have missed and hit himself in the bicep? Got my doubts, folks. Really got my doubts. That's one of the reasons I'm suspicious here. Plus, this... Again, it's tempting to violate FCC regs. Ain't going to do it for those of you who are on the stations that carry the program. But yeah, right. He was cutting his own wrist with a box cutter and just slipped and hit himself in the bicep. He did. Apparently, there were some empty sleeping pills. Maybe those were kicking in, but I've got my doubts. Unless he was awfully wasted on those sleeping pills. Sounds like maybe somebody was doing the job for him. Continuing, his death came as swindle investors began looking for ways to recoup their losses. Funds that lost big to Maddoff were also facing investor lawsuits and backlash for failing to properly vet Maddoff and overlooking red flags that could have steered them away. It's not immediately known what kind of scrutiny de la Ville Chouet was facing over his losses. De la, and now it's pronounced Ville, comes from rich French lineage with the Magon part of his name referring to one of France's most powerful families. The Magon name is even listed on l'Arc de Triomphe in Paris, a monument commissioned by Napoleon in 1806. He's irreproachable, said Bill Rapavy, who was Access International's chief operating officer before founding his own firm in 2007. De Ville Chouet's firm enlisted intermediaries with links to wealthy Europeans to garner investors. Among them was Philippe Junot, a French businessman and friend who was the former husband of Princess Caroline of Monaco, and Prince Michael or Prince Michel of Yugoslavia. De la Ville Chouet, the former chairman and chief executive of Crédit Lyonnais Securities USA, was also known as a keen sailor who regularly participated in regattas and was a member of the New York Yacht Club. By the way, Crédit Lyonnais was dirty as hell, too. I would also note that Philippe Junot was married into the royal family of Monaco. There was a branch of the P2 Lodge to which the late Princess Grace was reportedly connected. And when Princess Grace died, the former Grace Kelly, when Princess Grace died in a car accident, turned out she also had been hooked up with, among others, Licio Gelli, the Grand Master of the P2 Lodge. So again, note that this guy was investing on behalf of the European elite. Note that he was part of the French aristocracy and financial elite. They are a major element of the Bormann Capital Network, as were the Thiessen. So where did the money go? They say investors may have taken some of it. And again, who knows? The guy supposedly took a whole bunch of sleeping pills. I've never attempted suicide, let alone killed myself, so I can't say if the sleeping pills are kicking in. Whether you miss your wrists enough to hit yourself in the bicep. Sounds to me like maybe he was getting done, though, and maybe he was actually struggling, but who knows? That's a heck of a miss. And also, I think there's reason to suspect that foul play is something that could very well befall others connected to Lee Harvey Madoff, the alleged lone nut of this whole operation. Following is an AP story by Jay Lindsay from December 19th of 2008, Dateline Boston, headlined, Massachusetts investors saw inside Madoff scam. It reads in part, his repeated warnings that Wall Street money manager Bernard Madoff was running a giant Ponzi scheme have cast Harry Markopolos as an unheeded prophet. But people who know or worked with Markopolos say it wasn't prescience that helped him foresee the collapse of Madoff's alleged $50 billion fraud. Instead, they say diligence and a strong moral sense drove his quixotic 9-year quest to alert regulators about Madoff. And by the way, he'd been alerting the SEC for some time. Skipping down, in 2005, he submitted a report to the Securities and Exchange Commission saying it was, quote, highly likely, unquote, that, again quoting, Madoff Securities is the world's largest Ponzi scheme, unquote. In the report, he says he knew his research could ruin people's careers and asked the SEC to be discreet about circulating the report and his name. In this report to the SEC, by the way, look what he wrote, quote, I am worried about the personal safety of myself and my family, unquote, he wrote. That in his 2005 report to the SEC. Well, who was he afraid of? I don't think he was afraid of Lee Harvey Madoff. Who knows? Maybe Mr. Vieux could have profited from the insights of Mr. Markopoulos. Again, I think there's a whole lot more here than just a lone nut. One of my favorite words, obviously, something that I use a lot, is milieu. And in investigating the operations of Lee Harvey Madoff, and again, the sarcasm couldn't be exaggerated. This is no lone nut, folks, any more than Lee Harvey Oswald was. The milieu, or as a trusted friend and associate put it, the community of interests or Interessengemeinschaft that of which the Madoff operation was part, is well worth noting. There is a New York Times article that talks about some of the milieu, my favorite word again. This from the New York Times of December 17th of 2008, an article by Eric Konigsberg, in fraud case, middlemen in spotlight. As a go-between who shepherded clients and their money to Bernard L. Madoff, Walter M. Knoll became so prosperous that he was only too happy to show off his good fortune to the world. In 2002, Vanity Fair dispatched the photographer Bruce Weber to shoot a lavish spread of Mr. Knoll's wife and their 5 grown daughters at his home in Connecticut. That was followed in 2005 by a town and country story on the Knoll family's tropical retreat in Moustique, skipping down. Of Mr. Knoll, again, one of the middlemen in this operation. Speaking of the family, they built a modestly prosperous life in Greenwich and were perhaps best known among associates for their Christmas cards, the people with 5 stunning girls, in the words of a family friend. Quote, "As we know, Walter's success came after several thin years," wrote John J. McCloy II, a banker from Greenwich who described himself and his wife Laura as the Knowles' best friends for more than 30 years, unquote, in May in a letter recommending to the Knowles to membership in a private club. Well, John J. McCloy II is the son of John J. McCloy I, who was not only chairman of the Chase Manhattan Bank, not only one of the people who set up the M Fund and the Black Eagle Trust, as reported in the consummately important book Gold Warriors by Peggy and Sterling Seagrave. He also was a key Warren Commission member. He also was U.S. High Commissioner for Germany and helped to release many of the top Nazi war criminals into the service of the Gehlen Organization and ultimately into the service of the Republican Party, courtesy of the Crusade for Freedom. John J. McCloy, interestingly enough, to give you an idea how tight these milieu, plural, are, John J. McCloy was a brother-in-law of Konrad Adenauer of Germany, the first chancellor of Germany, and a front in many ways for the Underground Reich. And C. Lewis Douglas, the chairman of the Finance Commission for the U.S. military government that was administering Germany after the war. They were all brothers-in-law. They were all married to daughters of a key Morgan partner named Frederick Zinser. John J. McCloy II, like John J. McCloy I, a member of the American Council for Germany, one of the things that helps to coordinate German and American policy, and something that is inextricably linked with the various Bormann networks. So Walter Knoll's best friend for 30 years, one of the key Madoff people, John J. McCloy II, the son of John J. McCloy I, who, among other things, helped to tab Lee Harvey Oswald as the lone nut behind President Kennedy's assassination. Of course, he was not a lone nut. So another name that crops up here in connection with Lee Harvey Madoff is former SEC and Exchange Commission boss Arthur Levitt. The Washington Post's, the Chicago Tribune's Swamp Politics, that's their Washington, D.C. Operation, has an article, The Swamp, Madoff SEC's Very Cozy Tie by Frank James. Ex-Securities and Exchange Commission boss Arthur Levitt yesterday fired back at critics trying to lay at his feet some of the blame for the Bernie Madoff scandal, saying he wasn't asleep at the switch. At this point, I don't see any evidence that the SEC dropped the ball, unquote. Levitt, who's now an advisor to private equity shop Carlyle Group, told the New York Post. He's shocked. He doesn't see any gambling going on. Former SEC head, now he works for the Carlyle Group, which, among other things, is where the Bush and bin Laden family fortunes, quite literally, meet. Who audited the Maddoff firm? Check this out from Bloomberg.com. Investment advisor Oxia warned clients of Madoff's red flags. Skipping down, Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities LLC used Freeling and Horowitz, an auditor operating out of a 13 by 18-foot location in an office park in New York City's northern suburbs. Madoff was charged by federal prosecutors on December 11th with running what he said was a $50 billion Ponzi scheme. The auditor signed off on Madoff's annual financial statement through October 31st of 2006, according to a copy obtained by Bloomberg News. Now check this out. New York-based Oxia urged clients last year not to invest with Madoff's firm after learning the identity of the New City, New York-based auditor, according to Jake Waltauer, head of advisory services at Oxia. Freeling and Horowitz included one partner in his late 70s who lives in Florida, a secretary, and one active accountant. Skipping down, another woman in a nearby office, Leslie Kusar, said the man who comes to the auditor's office does so for 10 to 15-minute periods and wears tight pants and tie-dyed shirts. Kusar said she never saw anyone else go into the office during the day, but at about 5:30 p.m. another man would show up and use the location. He's in and out of there, unquote, Kusar said. So that's who's doing this. One of the sidelights, and I'm going to have to attenuate this. This is an example of why listeners should be using the website, because just not going to have time to go into this past a point. But one of the big losers in the Madoff scandal are not only individual Jewish investors, many of whom invest in Israel, but also many Jewish charities and also charitable efforts that help to support Israeli infrastructure. This, as another Mideast war of whatever size and duration remains to be seen, is breaking out. The Jewish Journal talks about how many, and again, this is an article from December 12th, how many Jewish investors got burned. This will be excerpted and discussed at greater length in the description for the show. San Francisco Chronicle of Wednesday, December 17th of 2008, has an article, Jewish Charities Lose Big with Madoff Investments. Skipping down, experts estimate that about 5% of all money donated by American Jews and 20% donated to Jewish causes goes to Israel. And Elie Wiesel's foundation lost nearly everything. Elie Wiesel, a Holocaust survivor, his foundation was almost completely bankrupted. Anti-Semitic web postings are up in the wake of the Madoff scandal. I would also note that a consortium of European banks that bought out ABN AMRO and apparently lost a lot in the subprime crisis are now going to be able to scapegoat Lee Harvey Madoff. The Bormann Group, as discussed in the book Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile, and in For the Record 305, uses Jews. Please go to the 305 and to the Bormann book in order to access that information. Why would a Nazi network use Jews? Well, several reasons. First of all, what a great cover for a Nazi money-moving operation than Jews. Second of all, since that operation, the Bormann Group, is the largest aggregate of money power under a single control in history, as tabbed by one knowledgeable banker, you can blame control of the economy on the Jews. And then when it goes down, you can scapegoat the Jews. Also, before the Nazis liquidated the Jews, they expropriated all of their property. What a great way of expropriating Jewish property, perhaps prior to exterminating them, than to have a Bormann Jew set up the vehicle for looting that property. We're going to conclude with an article from the worldtribune.com. Doomsday. U.S. report warns of strategic shock leading to massive unrest. It's from December 15th. The report by the U.S. Army War College's Strategic Institute said that a defense community paralyzed by conventional thinking could be unprepared to help the United States. Skipping down. Deliberate employment of weapons of mass destruction or other catastrophic capabilities, unforeseen economic collapse, and those are among the disasters for which our military may not be prepared. Well, we'll see what happens, folks. This, however, wraps up For the Record program number 658, Side 2. Update on the meltdown. My name is Dave Emory. This has been recorded on December 28th of 2008. Happy New Year.